attendees. So you probably got that little automated voice and you need to click it. All attendees will be muted during the program. Each speaker will automatically be full screen when they're speaking, so you don't need to go back and forth between gallery view and speaker view. The speaker bios were on your Zoom admission email, and they're also at sierra2.org, and we'll post that link in the chat room once we get going. Our timekeeper is Mimi Budd. I don't know if we can see her face quickly. We've allotted 7 to 10 minutes per speaker, with the Q&A following the presentations. And all questions should be posted in the chat box to questions for panel. You'll see that little button that you can do that to. Please indicate if your question is intended to be directed to a specific speaker or not. Doesn't matter, you can have an open-ended question. Do not post questions, we ask you, to individual speakers in the chat box, or it might get missed, because all our curator of questions is going to be looking at the little knob that says questions for panel. And Andrea Rosen is our curator of questions, and she's going to be doing her best to curate all your questions so that a variety of topics and as many questions get addressed. That emphasis on doing her best. She's very good at this, but there will be some duplicative questions we expect, or maybe we can't quite get to everything, but we'll do our best. We are willing to go beyond 8 p.m. if there are questions that still want to be asked, and if our speakers are willing to stick around, but we'll see how that goes as time goes on. And we ask that you use the chat box only for questions and not for general comments or conversation. We really want you to stay focused on the speakers. The speakers have worked really hard to put together comprehensive programs and to stick to our time frame for each of them, and we appreciate that very much. So with that, we're going to begin. We're going to start with Greg Chu, who is a senior urban planner with SACOG, and he's going to provide an overview of housing needs in our region. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me, Kathy?
Yes, very well.
Okay, and let me know when you can see the screen. Can you see my screen, Kathy?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Greg Chu. I'm with the Sacramento Council of Governments, the SACOG. We serve as a 6-county transportation planning region agency for the SACOG region. I'm going to talk about 3 key themes. For some reason now it's not where, okay. So 3 key themes in my presentation. One is we need more housing. Second, we need to prevent sprawl and promote infill. And third, we need to allow for more diverse housing types. So one of the things that's happening in the pandemic that everyone's talking about is what's going on with real estate and housing in general. We're seeing a run up in prices. We're seeing a run up in rents. People are having a hard time purchasing. There's many reasons for it, but one of the ones that commonly comes up is that there's a shortage of housing. It's not just here in Sacramento, not just in California, but in throughout the U.S. And there's an estimate that there's as many as 4 million houses short in the U.S. compared to how many households there are. Lots of people doubling up and finding other ways to get housing, but we're 4 million units short. And the state of California estimates that 2.5 million houses are short here in this state. Just to give you some context, there's 14 million that exist. So that's how great the shortage is. So if we look at production over a multi-decade period, we look at what we've actually produced versus what our long-term need is. Our long-term need is about 180,000 units to match the state's annual growth. Some years we are above it and before it and below it. And for the years that were below it, we need to make it up. So it's a snowball effect. Since the recession, we've really fallen off, or even since the 90s, but really fallen off dramatically in the state. So in this state, the state legislature back in the late 60s realized that in order to make sure that we have enough housing, they implemented a law called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, or the Housing Element Process. And that is to make sure that local governments kind of have an idea what that they need to plan for and zone for We take it in an 8-year period of time. SACOG has a role in that. So the state's estimated that we need almost 154,000 units in the next 8-year period of time. That translates down to the city of Sacramento's about almost 46,000 units of housing. How that is addressed, the next speaker will probably talk about that in the city's housing element. But when we talk about actual production, at SACOG, we look at growth projections, we look at job rates, growth, how much capacity we have, land, et cetera, just to keep up with growth over between 2016 and 2040, we need almost 11,000 units of housing production in the 6-county area. And since the recession, we've been building about half that amount. So the deficit keeps growing, and that's reflected in the shortage of housing that we have. So the second thing I want to talk about is if we're going to house people, one thing that we want to do as regional planners is to prevent sprawl and promote infill. So sprawl is basically the low density development on the outer edges of the urban areas. Some of the negative impacts from it are more auto dependence, congestion, conversion of farmland and building on farmland and open space, air pollution, and less housing per acre. So at SACOG, we have what's called the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and that is to address how to manage sprawl and to focus our growth, manage our growth in the region. To prevent sprawl, we're investing in transportation alternatives such as bike and pedestrian and transit facilities, encourage more compact developments and consistent land uses, and a range of housing products, and encourage infill. So this just gives one example of the environmental impacts of growth far from the core. So in the Sacramento core area, you can see it as green. The green and yellow areas are those areas that have the less vehicle miles traveled. That's how many annual average day household vehicle miles are made. And the darker it gets, so green and yellow are the lowest, and red is the highest. As we get further and further away from the urban core, we get more and more vehicle miles traveled, or basically air pollution and carbon footprint impacts. Third thing I want to talk about is to allow for housing types, so different housing types. If we're going to be able to have a quality of life in this region, and we're going to have enough housing in this region, we need to have different products for different reasons. So at SACOG, we look at, we group things in terms of our projections based on 3 categories of housing types. Large lot, that's single family houses on larger than 5,000 square foot lots. Small lot, which is single family on 5,000 or less square feet. And attached products, which are anything that is considered multifamily, duplexes on up. So where we've, the green shows what the need is between 2016 and 2040. And the orange shows what the last 10 years on average have been. This is the annualized chart. And the product type that we're missing the most is the attached product. And that's where affordability comes in. So how do they relate? Houses that, if you have a higher income, you have a lot more options. If you have a lower income, your multifamily is cheaper because it's generally smaller, it uses less land, shared facilities, and so forth. This chart here shows what the average, in this region, what the average household has depending on the housing type that they're in. The single family has the highest income and the apartments have the lowest. The missing middle, which I'll talk about in a second, is somewhere in between. So there's other reasons, not just affordability, that we want to consider why housing options are needed. First of all, in the 1950s, we had a majority of households that had children in them. So today, only 1/5 of US households have children in them under 18. In addition, almost 2/3 of all US households, 63%, have only 1 or 2 occupants in them. And that number is actually, that percentage is actually growing over time. So there's other demographic changes that are happening: later marriage, fewer kids, diversity of ethnic and racial growth, and different lifestyles, household formation starting later, cost of housing relative to wages. We're at tough time right now for that. Lower ownerships of home ownership, desirability for walkable communities, and one of the big ones during the pandemic is working from home. These are all changes that are just affecting the housing market and people looking for different types of products out there. So one of the things that we are looking at in this region is what's called the missing middle. That is a term for the housing types that happened before the Second World War that were in regular single-family residential areas, duplexes, triplex, quad, cottage apartments, accessory dwelling units, which are known as granny flats, and retail above, housing above retail. So 90% of the residential land in this 6-county region are single-family only. They do not allow for any of these products. That's for the entire region. The city is a little bit lower number, but we don't even allow the possibility of these. Well, the accessory dwelling units we can now, but the other products we don't. So the thing that we look for in this region is if we're gonna prevent sprawl and provide enough housing for the residents and the natural growth that we're gonna have, then each community is gonna have to find its own solutions to find ways to provide housing. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thanks, Greg. That was great. We really appreciate it. Before we go on, I just want to say, I told you that the little button in the list of where to pose the questions is called Questions for a Panel. In fact, it's called, what's it called, Andrea? Panel to the questions or something. So you're going to have to kind of go through everyone's list of names till you find it. I see we've already had one gentleman, Harold Thomas, who's posted his question in chat. We've asked that people not do that, that they post them to the panel directed icon button. So Harold.
So it's put questions for the panel.
Put questions for the panel, yeah.
Yeah.
And as I said, I am also going to copy the information on all of that to you guys in the chat box right now. And in the meantime, I got to do that with just a break here to start. I'm sorry, because it takes a little bit. Okay, so there's that one.
So Kathy, I'd like to just say something to the people who are asking questions. In community meetings like this, where we're really trying to educate ourselves and share information, a good principle to live by is share the oxygen. And I want to ask people to think about that in posing their questions too. I'm getting a ton of questions from 2 or 3 people, which means that all the people out there who are still formulating their questions are going to come in, you know, during the middle and end of the presentation. It'll be very hard for everybody to have a fair shot at getting a question asked. So please keep in mind the community principle of share the oxygen. Thanks.
Okay, I'm getting the last group into the chat box and then we'll go to Matt. Thank you, Matt, for your patience. You're always a patient person. Let's see, did that one go? Edit, paste. All right, let's see if that worked. All right, next up is Matt Hurdle. He is the acting long-range planning manager with the city of Sacramento, and he is the guy who's going to provide us with the overview of the proposed changes to the city general plan, including the proposal to change R1 zoning to Plex zoning. So Matt, you got a big load on your shoulders. We've given you just a few minutes extra time. So give us the skivvy, give us the whole overview.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate the invitation from SCNA to be here this evening. So Sacramento is currently conducting 3 major planning efforts: the 2040 General Plan Update, the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, and our housing element, which is an 8-year housing strategy. These planning processes are about determining what type of city we want to be, and how are we going to address the challenges facing our city over the next 20 years. We are approximately 2 years into a 3-year planning process for Sacramento 2040. In January, our city council directed staff to proceed with the draft land use map, other key strategies for the purposes of preparing the draft 2040 general plan. This includes the key strategy of permitting a greater array of housing types in single unit neighborhoods. We are now in phase 3, where our planning team is drafting the key policy documents and beginning the environmental review process. The Master Environmental Impact Report will evaluate any potential impact that general plan policies and programs may have on the environment, including any potential impact on infrastructure such as sewer and water. These documents are anticipated to be ready for public review in September, with final council adoption currently slated for March 2022. By 2040, our city is projected to grow by 69,000 new housing units and 77,000 new jobs. 92% of these new housing units will be in opportunity areas, such as the central city, along commercial corridors, and near transit. One of the key strategies for the 2040 general plan encourages high-density mixed-use housing along these corridors and near transit, while only 8% of our future growth is to occur in our established neighborhoods. Through over 2 years of outreach, several priorities have risen to the top, including climate change, equity, and inclusive economic development, and of course, housing. Residents have stated that they want a city where folks of all backgrounds with varying income levels can afford to live. The 2040 General Plan key strategies and forthcoming draft policies and programs are based on analysis and best practices. They are thoughtful but meaningful responses to our most pressing challenges. It's no secret that the city of Sacramento needs a lot more housing, in particular, lower cost housing. 2020 was our largest number of new housing units in 15 years. However, even in this banner year, we were still 2,000 units short to meet the actual need. To meet our lower income housing need, through only regulated affordable housing, we would need to find $7.5 billion in the next 8 years, with the city of Sacramento's portion being $2 billion. In order for us to meet this tremendous need for lower cost housing, yes, we must build more regulated affordable housing, but we also must build more lower cost housing that does not require subsidy, such as manufactured housing, accessory dwelling units, and duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. As part of our housing element, we've identified many policies and about 50 housing programs under 8 overarching goals, as shown here. No single policy or program will solve the housing crisis on its own. The key strategy to permit a great array of housing types is just one small slice of the larger housing pie. It'll take many policies, programs, and a strong funding commitment from the federal, state, and local governments to begin to tackle the tremendous need. I'll quickly highlight some of the significant housing element programs that will increase the availability and affordability of housing. As soon as the housing element is adopted by council in August, we will revisit the amount of the fee on new development to pay for affordable housing. In 2019, about $5 million was collected from this fee to support affordable housing. We will also study potentially requiring new development to build regulated affordable housing on site. Staff will continue to work with City Council to consider establishing additional sources of affordable housing funding. And as an example, earlier this year, Council approved $31.5 million for affordable housing. The city has been awarded a grant by the state to develop permit-ready ADU plans that will be available to Sacramento residents, making it easier and cheaper to build this affordable by design housing type. Once the general plan is adopted early next year, staff will identify and rezone additional sites in high resource areas of the city to create more opportunities for affordable housing in areas that offer low-income children and adults the best chance at economic advancement, high educational attainment, and good physical and mental health. The city is also in the process of reviewing city-owned land that can be used for affordable housing. Under the housing element goal of advancing equity and inclusion, we are coming to grips with our own land use history of racial and socioeconomic segregation. I know many of you are familiar with this history, since SCNA posted on your website a thoughtful and insightful piece entitled "The Color Lines That Divided Us." Throughout the country, including here in Sacramento, redlining maps were used by financial institutions to assess the level of risk for making home loans. Red areas, as shown in the map on the left, were described as racial hazards, where infiltration of subversive races has occurred. Yellow areas were seen to be declining for having multifamily housing in existing minority populations. In this way, not only were minority groups not granted government-backed home loans with favorable terms in their own neighborhoods, but were also prohibited from moving to many of the best and still desirable green and blue neighborhoods through racial restrictive covenants. While the Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed racially restrictive covenants and government-sponsored redlining, the effects of past systemic segregation and exclusion in housing are still apparent in many areas of Sacramento today. As shown in yellow on the zoning district map, 70% of Sacramento's neighborhoods are zoned for single family, equating to almost half of the city's 101 square miles of land area. State housing element law requires jurisdictions to comply with AB 686 to affirmatively further fair housing. This means taking meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation, address disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, and foster inclusive communities. The primary action cities can take is to provide more lower cost housing options in the highest opportunity areas of the city. Sacramento continues to experience a housing shortage, and duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes are considered missing middle housing types and are less expensive than single unit homes. Majority of the city's neighborhoods are currently zoned for single unit homes, the most expensive housing type to own or rent. The exclusion of lower cost housing types prevents many residents from moving to neighborhoods with good parks, schools, employment, and other desirable amenities. These missing middle housing types are not only more affordable rental options, but would provide opportunities for entry-level home ownership as well. Missing middle housing are buildings with multiple units compatible in scale and form with detached single-family homes. There are over 2,300 duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes that exist in the city today. These housing types were once allowed throughout Sacramento's neighborhoods and neighborhoods throughout the country. Here are a few photos of each to demonstrate how they currently fit the scale of the existing neighborhoods. As you will notice from these photos, and by walking around your neighborhood, many homes were simply reconfigured to create a smaller units within the four walls of a large single-family home. These two photos are of duplexes in Land Park. Photo on the left is a triplex in Oak Park, and on the right is a triplex in your own community of Curtis Park. Photo on the left is a fourplex in Land Park, and on the right is a fourplex in East Sacramento. And even though City Council provided unanimous direction for staff to proceed with this key strategy, we are still about 1.5 years away from the effective date. This slide shows the two key milestones for this policy to take effect. The 2040 General Plan is slated for adoption in about 10 months. Once the 2040 General Plan is adopted, the city's Planning and Development Code, commonly referred to as Zoning Code, would be updated in 2022 with updated definitions and development standards. Anticipated that the effective date of this change will be by the fall of 2022. This slide outlines the anticipated approach for updating the development standards to allow for a greater array of housing types in single unit zones. Using a grant from SACOG, a consultant team will be hired that specialize in development standards. We then anticipate forming a working group similar to the one that we created for the accessory dwelling units, which included council members and planning and design commissioners and architects, etc. Robust neighborhood level community engagement will be conducted. Our team will work closely with neighbors to create development standards that strike the balance of maintaining the current scale and feel of their block while also allowing a few more neighbors to move in. Each year, staff will provide an update to City Council and the California Department of Housing and Community Development about the type and number of housing units being built in our city. I'm going to use a couple of slides to explain the purpose and importance of development standards for all housing types. Here's a representative example of how the development standards currently work in R1 zones as codified in our Planning and Development Code. This image shows a standard residential lot size of 52 feet by 100 feet or 5,200 square feet. As noted in the previous slides, the specific development standards for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes will be updated to reflect the recent policy direction while maintaining the neighborhood scale. This example of the city's current R1 development standards illustrates the key elements. Minimum setbacks. So a front setback matches the setbacks of the adjacent homes. If there's no adjacent homes, then the front back is 20 feet. Rear setbacks, 15 feet from the property line. Side setbacks, typically 5 feet on each side. Maximum lot coverage, otherwise known as required residential open space, means the total amount of the lot that can be covered by buildings and structures. The current R1 lot coverage cannot exceed 50%. The maximum height is 35 feet, is illustrated here. This image also illustrates the design guidelines for bulk control. It's important to understand that there's a national conversation taking place about the role of land use and zoning, with many states and cities taking actions to allow a great array of housing types in single-family zones. On the local level, cities like Minneapolis and Portland have also changed their land use and zoning regulations to allow a wider range of small-scale, multi-unit housing in all of their residential neighborhoods. And earlier this month, Charlotte, North Carolina City Council approved a growth plan that would allow duplexes and triplexes throughout the city. Grand Rapids, the second biggest city in Michigan, has been permitting more units in areas traditionally zoned for single-family homes for over a decade. And many cities in California, including Berkeley, South San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, have received council direction to study allowing a great array of housing types. On the state level, Oregon allows a variety of housing types in any city of more than 10,000 people. California is considering Senate Bill 9, which already passed the Senate and is now first passed in the Assembly. This would allow homeowners in the state to divide their property into 2 lots and allow 2 homes to be built on each of those lots. The American Planning Association supports this bill. On the regional level, SACOG's Housing Policy Toolkit is a menu of policy options and best practices for removing governmental constraints to new housing. One of SACOG's recommendations is to expand missing middle zoning and to allow for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes on all residentially zoned land. Additionally, San Mateo County is currently completing a county-wide study on missing middle housing, which they're expecting to complete in September. President Biden's American Jobs Plan acknowledges the seriousness of the national housing crisis and calls out local exclusionary zoning laws like single-unit zoning as a major contributor to inflated housing and construction costs. Biden's plan will include a new competitive grant program that awards funding to jurisdictions that take concrete steps to eliminate zoning barriers. In closing, the status quo is working for many of us in the city, especially those fortunate enough to own a condo or a home, but it is not working for many Sacramento residents. This policy change is about creating opportunities for people of a variety of incomes to live in a neighborhood with access to amenities such as better quality transit, parks, and schools. It has been statistically shown that people living in more affluent zip codes live longer than those in lower income zip codes. This policy change will also help to reduce sprawl by providing housing closer to employment, transit, and amenities, reducing traffic, reducing air pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. Missing middle housing will give more folks the opportunity to stay in their hometown of Sacramento, rather than finding a home in another jurisdiction where it may be less expensive to purchase or rent. If as a city, we want to move from symbolic statements about the housing crisis, racial equity, and climate change, then this is a clear, concrete step the city can take. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matt, very much. We appreciate your time as well and your preparation. I'd like to note that our first 2 speakers have not had the little bell go off to remind them that they've met or exceeded their time, so that's great. Next, we will hear from William Berg, who is president of Preservation Sacramento, and he's going to be talking about how the proposed changes to the General Plan 2040 might impact historic neighborhoods. So take it away, William. Well, and just a reminder before he gets started, that icon where you can post your questions is called Put Questions for Panel Here, and it follows John Matthews' name in the list of names. So I noticed in the chat box a few people are having a hard time finding it.
All right, thank you. My name is William Berg. I'm president of Preservation Sacramento. We're a citywide historic preservation nonprofit. And the subject I'm going to discuss is how this will affect historic districts, as opposed to historic neighborhoods, which is a more general term. Historic districts have a specific meaning, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it actually does mean. But first, we're going to take a trip to LA, a city that's known for its sprawl and high prices. Last year, Los Angeles Conservancy paid for a study by Donovan Brickema, a preservation economist, for how the economics of historic preservation in Los Angeles work. And they looked at their HPOZs. What they found is older apartment buildings were cheaper than newer apartment buildings. Pre-1920 to 1959 were less expensive for a studio than those built from 1960 to 2000, and much less expensive than those built from 2000 to 2018. Rental affordability is higher in what they call HPOZs. It's the term they use for historic districts. So those neighborhoods are more affordable than apartments outside of the historic districts. Gentrification tends to happen less in HPOZs than in other neighborhoods. They did an analysis of where are the HPOZs, which are the gray boxes, and where did gentrification take place. And in some cases there was overlap, but there usually wasn't. And what gentrification is a little more complex thing, but we also found that race is a factor. People who live in historic districts tend to be less likely to be white. So they're more diverse neighborhoods than the rest of the city of Los Angeles. In terms of income, they tend to make a little bit less than average LA, but not by much. So there's a little bit more of income diversity as well as ethnic and racial diversity in historic districts than in the area outside of those neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles. They're also denser. They found that the population density per square mile was twice in historic districts what it is in the rest of the city. And a lot of those newer neighborhoods are car-centric neighborhoods. The older neighborhoods tend to be streetcar suburbs, more like neighborhoods like Curtis Park and East Sacramento. And so they have more potential density. They also found more of the land was zoned residential and less of it was zoned single family, which meant there's more room for people to live in historic districts than in the rest of the city of Los Angeles. So that means there's an automatic bump to the amount of density. The average value per square foot is about the same for new housing and historic district housing, but the total value is less because the buildings tend to be smaller and the lots tend to be smaller, which means they're still more affordable despite being this beautiful product, which is of quite a sufficient size. Neighborhoods that are historic districts also have higher transit ridership, and that also implies greater use of active mobility, walking and bicycling. So again, it's because of their transit-oriented design in the first place and their creation before the age of the automobile. There's also room to grow in historic districts. Many of them have large amounts of space in the back where there's room for ADUs or there's room to put in new infill. So the idea that historic districts mean all growth stops inside a district is absolutely false. And we can see from the zoning here, only about a third of HPOZs are zoned single family residence or contain single family residences versus 85% of the rest of the city of LA, while 39% of HPOZs consists of housing that's 5 or more units. Here in Sacramento, the preservation movement started in the 60s and 70s. Folks like Jim and Dee Dee Cathcart and their home on 20th Street, which kind of the traditional idea of a historic home. But most of the buildings we're talking about historic building stock, are what we saw earlier, missing middle housing. This missing middle diagram just looks like a map of Midtown because we have all these different housing types. But because they're designed to fit in well with single family homes, people walk through these neighborhoods and don't realize that it's 90% multifamily because it's all intended to work together. There's also an idea called filtering. It was briefly mentioned in the chat window. The idea is that if you add new housing, then people with more money can move into the more expensive new housing and people with less funds can move into the old housing. Where preservation comes into that is if you demolish the old housing to build the new housing, then there's nothing to filter into. So a filtering strategy is along the lines of what Sacramento Old City Association has been talking about since the 70s, that we could double the population of the downtown area without demolishing a single building. And that's almost a city we could make citywide. A lot of the early preservation fights for Preservation Sacramento or for SACA were buildings like the Maidstone and the Merriam Apartments and the Francesca, which would be called awesome new urban infill today. They had no parking, but developers wanted to tear them down because they had no parking. Now we have around 30 historic districts, but you'll notice almost all of them, except for downtown Oak Park, are in the central city. And why is that? Partially, it's because of a long-term legacy regarding the way we looked at our central city. And a lot of those historic districts are also very urban. People don't realize that Merchants Row and Plaza Park and Cathedral Square downtown are all historic districts. So they're becoming more densely populated through adaptive reuse of historic buildings, many using tax credits or other incentives in order to facilitate urban growth. Our street is a very popular place, but it's a preservationist vision of adaptive reuse of historic buildings and new construction alongside it in order to take development pressure off of the adjacent neighborhoods and provide new housing, that additive idea of filtering. But even our more traditional neighborhoods have a wide diversity of architecture. And in case any of you are wondering, the building on the right would not be buildable even under the new zoning code because it has a floor area ratio of about 3. And what what they're talking about for the neighborhoods outside the central city is a max floor area ratio of 1. That diversity also applies to the people of the central city. Southside Park was called the League of Nations because of its extraordinary diversity and generations of migrant and immigrant communities coming to Sacramento from around the world. And the history of the neighborhood and its built environment reflects that diversity. Oak Park, one of our more recent historic districts, became a neighborhood of exodus after redevelopment. And the historic district includes both the architecture of the streetcar suburb and also the African-American history and the role of this community in that neighborhood. That's how we look at historic districts today. This is Newton Booth, one of the most recent historic districts in the city, established about a decade ago. Preservation Sacramento paid for the survey, and it is mostly a working class, mixed use, mixed density, missing middle neighborhood. The legacy of redlining and of redevelopment were part of what created a lot of these pressures. The original vision of redevelopment was that bulldozers would keep going all the way to Broadway and Alhambra. But as you can see, the areas that were not redlined were exempt. And that's part of why many of our most recognizable, beautiful neighborhoods, the fabulous 40s in East Sacramento, Land Park and Curtis Park, they're not historic districts today because instead of having this development pressure from redevelopment, and also because they were wealthy. You can see here the central city is by per capita one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, whereas North Sacramento and South Sacramento are poor. East Sacramento and Land Park relatively wealthy, and that wealth meant economic power and the ability to resist change that was considered undesirable. That was expressed in the zoning for these neighborhoods. This is the current land use map. You can see most of the city is zoned solely for single-family homes, except the central city, where all of these historic districts I'm talking about are. The buildings still exist because the historic districts protects the building, but allows new growth. And even in the 2040 general plan, you can still see there's still the emphasis on most of the new growth in the central city, but it's pretty much what we're used to. It's outside the central city where this is a very radical change. That's part of why we're seeing this strong reaction. One of the things we're doing right now, we've just begun a survey of the Richmond Grove neighborhood, which is a portion of the central city which doesn't have any historic districts, to find out, are there landmarks or districts within that? And then we're doing this process in conjunction with the city, and we'll be providing our information. Now, can other neighborhoods outside the central city become historic districts? Absolutely, and we're seeing tremendous interest from people in Curtis Park, from the Eichler district in Southland Park Hills, from East Sacramento. And this is the creation of historic districts is expensive, and most people can't afford to do it, but it is an established and existing tool to protect what's important about a neighborhood while leaving room for growth and leaving room for new infill, the same way that it clearly happens from Los Angeles to Sacramento. My concern is that I don't think that even if they don't adapt historic districts, those neighborhoods are not going to see a whole lot of change. They'll see a few units. What we will see, Dr. Jesus Hernandez did this map, is I think we're going to see a lot more effects in the less wealthy areas, the gray spots, lighter gray spots on this map, where there are no historic districts and the people have less economic power to resist development. And that's where a lot of these upcoming projects are likely to have the most effect unless the city takes proactive steps to address them. As part of the 2018 update to the Central City Specific Plan, there was a really good document called Anti-Displacement Gentrification Strategies that was produced as part of the plan, but almost none of the ideas were implemented. We're only seeing a very few of them in the 2020 general plan, but it really deserves a closer look. And in summary, historic districts are a powerful tool. They're expensive, and one of the ways that communities throughout the city, especially in those economically disadvantaged communities, is to demand that if the city moves forth with this, that they also survey for historic districts, and to demand the kind of protections outlined in 2018, some of the things that Matt mentioned, the steps taken to protect the neighborhoods that are there. Because as one of the commenters back in January when I talked about it the first time said, I put the quote up earlier, is now that Black communities are now finally getting into home ownership in these single family home neighborhoods. Now the city, of course, is saying, okay, it's time to redevelop single family home neighborhoods, and they're likely to see the worst of the effects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. It's always nice to hear from you, and your broad expertise across the city with regard to historic structures. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Chris Jones, and he is on the leadership committee with the Colonial Heights Neighborhood Association, and he's going to share some perspectives and thoughts on some possible other ways that may not have been considered to achieve some of the same goals that the city's trying to achieve. Go ahead,
Chris. Thank you. So I've got a couple of screens, so forgive me if I'm looking at all over the place here. So let's see, let's get this started. All right. Are you guys able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of upzoning and some alternatives that we can come up with to hopefully mitigate some of those results. So the first question that comes is, why should we upzone in the first place? There are some social justice and financial incentives to do so for the city. As you've heard, we have had a problem with redlining in the past. Pretty much everywhere in America has. That goes without saying, and it's definitely negatively affected people and families of color. I don't think anyone on this call is going to argue otherwise. But the narrative of the city, essentially, when it comes to upzoning, is that by allowing these duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, that it is going to somehow change the racial makeup of certain neighborhoods. The second pillar of the argument is that we want to generate more affordable housing and reduce the housing costs. That's technically true, at least on the face of it, in the sense that if you have more housing, in theory, competition would create lower prices. The third is meeting changing demographics needs. As we heard from SACOG, the household size has been shrinking. A lot of people live in one or two-person households. And so we want to meet that need. And then the fourth reason, which is relatively new to me, but I heard it mentioned here and there, is that we're looking for state grants. Essentially, the city and the county are selling our neighborhoods in exchange to get more points from the California Department of Housing and Community Development and to compete for grants and funding for various things. So, like I said, those are all the reasons that we heard officially, but I'm going to give you some actual data here that shows otherwise. So New York City did large-scale upzoning between 2000 and 2010, and there were statistical studies by New York University, peer-reviewed papers, and they found that these upzonings were actually statistically positively correlated with a between 5 and 9% decrease in the share of people of color in those areas. So that flies directly in the face of what you've heard so far, in the sense that, oh yes, by increasing the density, we're going to increase racial diversity. The research shows that actually it's the opposite of that. As far as prices and gentrification, both Chicago and Minneapolis had peer-reviewed studies that showed that housing prices actually increase after upzoning. They used the city limits in Minneapolis to do a quasi-experiment, and similar parcels on either side of the line. The houses in Minneapolis increased between 3 and 5% on average, more so in low-income communities. In Chicago, they found that 5 years after doing an upzoning, they had gotten no additional housing, but the land prices had increased, making it more expensive to live there. On top of that, the demographic preferences are also a little shaky, in the sense that while household sizes are shrinking, Redfin, the real estate website, did a survey where they analyzed their web traffic, and they found that 89% of people said that they would prefer a single family home with a yard instead of a comparable unit in a duplex or a triplex, even if it meant that they had to drive further into work. 33% of buyers search for only single family homes when they look. So a lot of those arguments that have been made in favor of upzoning and increasing our density don't really hold water. That we really have a problem where the evidence hasn't really been asked for or given to sufficient degree. That being said, not everything is all doom and gloom. There are alternatives. One of those is accessory dwelling units. The existing stuff in the 2040 plan is pretty good here. We need to enable and encourage ADU development in targeted communities. And that may mean sustainable public financing in low and moderate income neighborhoods. The approved library of plans that was mentioned earlier, that's really great. Expedited permits, all those and more need to come together to really reduce the costs and the friction when it comes to building those accessory dwelling units. According to SACOG's own numbers, they did an analysis and they found that the median ADU is about 600 square feet and rents for about $1,200 a month. That's a lot more affordable than what we've got going on, where the median house in Sacramento is about $425,000, about 1,600 square feet, give or take. And significant numbers of ADUs are they're not rented in the sense that they are made available to friends or family for either no or extremely low cost. So this has got to be a cornerstone of our strategy. The next piece is that we need to make housing affordable and sustainable. Right now, we have a regressive construction tax. According to the Community Development Department or the Building Department, 1,000 square foot home has a 16.5% tax when it comes to all the fees and impact fees and taxes and charges that come along with building it. A 2,500 square foot home has a 10% tax. And then you'll hear, the county and the city, and we'll sit around here scratching our heads wondering why all the new construction is big 2,500 square foot homes when it makes sense. Developers pay less for them. We need to fix that. We need to reduce that and reverse that situation. We also need to control the subsidized housing costs. As was mentioned earlier, it would take about $2.5 billion from the city out of a total $7 billion to build the subsidized housing that we need to get out of this housing crisis. The reason it costs so much, I cite the Lavender Courtyard that is out of the city's own documentation, is over $500,000 a unit. That's just ridiculous. At the Capitol Park Hotel, where they converted the rooms to a homeless shelter and eventually permanent supportive housing, that cost over $445,000 per unit. Like I said, the typical home in Sacramento is $425,000. There is no way we can subsidize our way out of this housing crisis if we can't control these costs and make it somewhat sustainable. If we could build affordable housing for half that price, we'd get twice as many units for the same amount of money. It's something that we really need to look at. Also, and the final piece that I have is that we need to invest in communities. I'm hearing a lot of stuff about how we need to allow low and moderate income people to move into high resource communities and high opportunity communities. I don't hear anything about improving those communities where people are already living. Not only is that more effective because people have family and historical ties to those communities and may want to stay there. Any increase in density, we saw in the previous presentation that about 8% of the growth is expected in established neighborhoods. Well, what happens to the other 92% of people who don't live in these high resource areas or move to these high resource areas? They're just left behind. We need to convert abandoned or underutilized commercial properties to residential, just like was talked about earlier with housing over retail. That's a great idea. I challenge the idea that we can't have sprawl. COVID has shown us that telecommuting is something that is viable and is likely here to stay. We can afford to spread out and build smaller, more affordable homes and encourage people to telecommute to offset the environmental and traffic impacts. And like I said, we also need to ensure that the low and moderate opportunity areas have access to resources and amenities to essentially meet them where they are. In conclusion, the results of upzoning as it is, we're likely to see a couple things happening. One of those is limited construction of what I'm calling market premium housing. As Mr. Berg said, new housing costs more than older housing. So when we see some of these homes converted into new units or possibly torn down to be replaced with new units, we're going to see rises in rents as they get upgraded. That has the more insidious effect of raising the rents of adjacent properties. If I charge $2,000 for my unit and you charge $1,500, well, you know that you can raise yours because it's still cheaper than mine. Filtering is something that got brought up, but filtering can take decades to actually take effect. In the meantime, those low and moderate income people are going to be displaced. I agree that it's not particularly likely that places like Curtis Park and East Sacramento and Land Park are going to see the majority of development, as much as they've been scapegoated into taking the responsibility for those things. Chances are where we're going to see the most development are places like Oak Park, which are still relatively cheap and have huge development upside with the Aggie Square project moving forward. It just doesn't make sense to spend $1 million on a lot in East Sacramento when you can buy 3 lots for that same price in Oak Park and double your money in 10 years. And that means that, like I said, people of color are going to be displaced. Low and moderate income people are going to be displaced. We're going to see increased market and luxury housing to accommodate the people that are moving here from the Bay Area. And finally, just pursuing an ideological solution that isn't really based around what people need or want is something that we can't just undo. My recommendation is that we amend our 2040 plan to remove, and our housing element to remove this part and use alternate methods, some of which I just described, to more effectively focus on producing the types of housing and the affordable housing that people want and need, instead of focusing on trying to grab headlines of being first in the state to do something. So in conclusion, like I said, this is something that ultimately we haven't really done a lot of good outreach on. They're trying now, but they should have done it before. And ultimately, with such a drastic change, if we are dead set on putting this forward, I'd recommend we put it to a vote and let people decide what their neighborhoods are going to look like. Thank you. Oh, Kathy, we can't hear you.
I've been talking and I was muted. I'm sorry. So thank you, Chris. And we're now going to go to Kirk Weibenberg on the board of the Land Park Community Association. And he's going to be sharing his alternatives to the community rezoning specific to the greater Land Park area as designated in the general plan, which does include Curtis Park.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you hear me and see my screen summary of support?
Yes, both.
Great, thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Thanks for attending on your everyone's busy schedule. I have been working in Greater Land Park, which is 1/10 of the city. It's one of the planning districts for the 2040 general plan, and it includes not only Sierra Curtis and a Land Park, but also the workforce and underserved neighborhoods of Upper Land Park, Carlton Track, Mangan Park, and Lower Franklin Boulevard. So we have quite a diversity, and we're interested in the protection of our at-risk communities. There are many aspects that we support to increase housing and make a contribution to not only the housing crisis, which may be short-term, but to the 20-year plan for the community. Smart growth, so to speak. Many of these things were brought up by Chris, and there's a strong agreement between our organizations. We honor the existing 2035 general plan and the principles of livability through complete neighborhoods. And complete neighborhoods, we still think, is the guiding strategy even for the housing element. We support the 2040 principles of equity, sustainability, preservation, and enhancement. The new principles of equity and sustainability are particularly important in these discussions. We support the development of first-time buyer programs and ADU construction financing assistance for disadvantaged communities subject to gentrification. We support a progressive permitting fee structure that does not favor the large development and penalize the small. We request investment in infrastructure that equalizes and completes all neighborhoods as livable. We assert our right to self-determination and bottom-up urban planning, starting at the neighborhood level, to develop strategies that protect and enhance the at-risk and underserved neighborhoods in our community. We support the revitalization of public transportation and our community corridors through higher density residential and mixed-use development. And we advocate for more housing choice and the enhancement of our community centers through the addition of missing middle housing adjacent to those commercial centers, providing a transition of density and scale to our traditional residential neighborhoods. Finally, we advocate for the role of local zoning authority to create a variety of communities and to maintain existing community character. Missing middle housing, as you see here, duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard, cottage, townhouses are middle because they have traditionally in urban planning and naturally evolved to provide a transition of scale from high density urban corridor development, 4 to 6 stories, for an example, down to single family neighborhoods. In the 2035 general plan, we have the principles and the law of infill development, which is for the city to promote and provide incentives for infill development, reuse, and growth in existing urbanized areas to enhance community character and optimize city investments in infrastructure and community facilities with the purpose of increasing housing diversity. But we want to point to enhancing community character. In the traditional neighborhoods that surround the city center, those neighborhoods are characterized by home ownership. Traditional low density neighborhoods have 3 to 8 units per acre. Where we are proposing is to look at our transportation corridors and commercial corridors to go much higher to the 5 to 12 units per acre that will support public transportation. And we see affordability as being a combination of housing costs and transportation costs and a unified strategy. When we were asked if we could support the housing strategy to put a greater array of housing types in our existing single unit neighborhoods, 40% of us said yes, 25% of us said maybe. In other words, somewhat support. We had 135 people on a Zoom meeting and went over the details on this and then surveyed them 5 days later. And we found that by far the majority thought that the question was asking if we would allow increased housing types in our neighborhood and assumed that we would have a voice to the location, that it would not be a uniform broad brush up zone of our R1 lots. So when this finally came out, which was to allow a wider range of housing types within, and you see, again, they use the word within, not throughout, but within the neighborhood. Again, a large number of people assumed that there would be a voice as to where the missing middle housing went. You can see that regarding the higher density implementation of the pink zones, that they're very clearly designated. And we were asked, do we approve those areas for high density 4 to 6 story buildings? And we were able to clearly say yes. So the first question was not as clear as the second in the city's surveys. Our character of our neighborhoods are simple. It's made of small, almost 100-year houses in nicely kept. It's made also of smaller unit cottages. These 2 cottages were recently bought by couples from San Francisco. They're now for rent, and they could be for conversion to townhouses. They're across the street from Sierra Curtis Neighborhood Association. We also have duplexes. The duplexes are throughout our neighborhoods, so that we do have duplexes on almost every corner throughout all of our neighborhoods. And in particular, in what are considered the high opportunity or privileged neighborhoods. We also have many granny flats and ADUs. Here's a picture of a typical ADU in a land park backyard. It's 16 feet tall, it's single story, it's 400 square feet conversion of a garage in the back and a 1,200 square foot single story behind it. Excuse me. This is important because recently we just looked at ADUs, and the city has been quite aggressive in its proposal. They proposed 35-foot height limits, 0 lot lines in many places, and 1,200 square foot of exemptions from lot coverage. As was brought up in previous issues or presentations, lot coverage indicates, as Matt said, open space in the area. And when you exempt 1,200 square feet, you quickly get to no open space. This is a 1,200 square foot ADU over a 4-stall garage. It's 35 feet tall, and it nearly dwarfs the house that it is in support of. That's in Land Park. This is in Sierra Curtis, a new house in the front and a 3-story, 35-foot flat roof structure in the back, probably about 1,200 square feet, larger than the house in the front. Why is this okay? And why is this okay? Well, it's okay because both of this is on a side street. So in a way, it has the mass and shape of a full house. And this unit is on an alleyway. We are advocating that 35-foot, 3-story structures on alleyways and side streets are fine. They just don't belong in people's backyards where the yards meet and privacy is completely obliterated. Still a change to come. So where do we want missing middle? Here's our neighborhood centers, which are typical in Land Park and in Sierra Curtis. And this is the kind of addition that we can see going on, a conversion over the 20 years. As buildings get replaced, they get 2 stories of residential built over them. Also, you can see in this typical transition of scale model from our current general plan that you have a higher density on the boulevards, and then behind them, you have townhouses, and behind them to the interior, you have single family houses with ADUs. This is a transition of mass and scale that is a definition of good urban planning. This is typical good looking townhouses built in Oak Park, cluster homes built in downtown. All of these fit almost in all of our neighborhoods, and we embrace these missing middle houses. Here it is in South Park, and you can see here, slightly different. As Matt was saying, the key is to keep the zoning requirements of the existing neighborhood. These zoning requirements have tighter side setbacks, front yard setbacks, et cetera. And so this is what a new 35-foot building looks like next to a house. These are
Kirk,
yes.
Hi, this is Mimi, the timekeeper, and you've met the time limit. And will you be able to conclude your remarks now, please?
Yeah, I'll put a wrap on them.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
These townhouses are $800,000, and this is another form of example of housing in the West Broadway specific plan that shows you height and setbacks and side yards are important because they can dwarf and overwhelm the housing next door. Many times you can get it appropriate, as this has been done in Crocker Village. So in conclusion, we believe that there is lots of opportunity for missing middle housing. We've seen it in the West Broadway specific plan. This is the area just south of Sutterville and the community college. This is Land Park and Sierra Curtis at our interface. And you can see already the density there. So our proposal is that we can find the places for missing middle housing. And if you can imagine purple bands that just go around the pink high density corridors, that is the transitional housing spot we're recommending. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. That was a lot of good visuals for us to see as well. Okay, we've saved the best for last, our own councilman, Jay Chenier. And let's see, we need to take down the screen share.
Oh, okay.
And then we can turn it over to Jay.
Thanks, Kathy. And
Chris, there you are, okay.
I'm here, thanks. Thank you, and I wanna appreciate SCNA for putting this together. This is a really important issue, and I'm going to be somewhat brief because I think it's important to be able to answer questions that people have. And I know you're going to extend the 8 o'clock, but I'm sure in this neighborhood, as always, there's lots of questions and viewpoints that we have. I also want to really thank all of the speakers that have come before me. I think this is, again, a really important discussion. I don't have any intention to go point by point where I disagree with folks, but I do want to ask our city staff to take a listen to this and respond to many of the points that were made. I think that's important. I don't want the conversation to end tonight. I think that this is an ongoing conversation that we need to have that's critical for the city. As always, it's great to listen to Bill Berg and his wealth of knowledge. Thank you, Bill, appreciate it. And some of my constituents, I don't know Kurt, but do know Chris, and we've had many meetings together, and I'm sure we'll
continue. Yeah, I can hear Jay in the background.
I'm sorry?
I think you're okay, Jay. I think it's somebody else.
Somebody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Background.
Anyway, so again, just a round of thanks for all for doing this. I think Matt Hurdle did a great job of where the city is and where they come out on this. I'm really proud of Sacramento, and I'm always proud of our neighborhood because we always stand up and do the right thing. But for Sacramento, I believe over the last half decade or so, we're really starting to look into the future and asking the question on a continuous basis, what's the city that we want to be? And that conversation has really been pushed hard in the last couple of years, certainly around the environment, but also around racial equity and diversity and the things that we're doing on those pieces. Those two issues, which we've spent an inordinate amount of time on and are spending dollars, and we'll spend quite a bit more, really come together when we start talking about housing. You can't be successful on the climate issue. You cannot be successful on the racial equity issue if you don't do the right thing on the housing issue. And I think the city has done that. When you look at the numbers and what we need to accomplish, and Greg did a good job laying out RENA and what that looks like for the city, it's on the one hand overwhelming, but on the other, a huge challenge for us to make sure that, again, we can be the city we want to be and undertake that collectively. I will say, as an aside here, you know, we've had a different city council over the last 5 months than we had certainly in my 9 years prior to that, 9.5 years prior to that, on controversial issues, and this is potentially a very controversial issue. We had a 9-0 vote. I think it might be the only unanimous vote we had on a controversial issue with this city council. And what it shows is that the council is together in moving forward on this. I think that, you know, this is an issue that we have a supply problem on. And my belief here, I don't want to go to rent control. There's a lot of things we need to do on anti-displacement measures. And part of our general plan, part of the work we're doing, and Chris mentioned Aggie Square, will be around anti-displacement. We want to keep people in their neighborhoods. That's a priority for us, but at the same time, expand the density. Again, good for the environment, and I believe good for diversity. I'll take a look at the New York and Minneapolis figures that Chris brought up. I don't know if New York was duplexes and tris and quads, but we'll take a look at that. But expanding the density to allow for more diversity in our neighborhoods. And it's not just racial diversity, it's also socioeconomic status diversity. I think that would be, again, the city that I want to live in as I move forward on this. We need, there are no silver bullets here. There's no way we get to 45,000 units with one solution. And we need to be bold. We need to take some strategic risks as we go forward. Remember, we can always come back and change things if they're not working. And I believe, and I totally understand this because we've gone through this on lots of different issues. Fear is a main driver in a lot of people when they don't have the knowledge of what will happen. And until those things happen, it can be really hard, and change is hard. I think the ADU discussion has been a really good example of that. We had a lot of pushback on that. I think that we have had 72, Matt can correct me on this, 72 or 74 ADU applications since we changed the requirements on that. So a very small amount. I think a lot of the same will happen with the R1 zoning change that I believe will happen. So my hope is that working with our communities, and we've done a fair amount of outreach on this, quite a bit of outreach actually on the general plan and others, we'll continue to do that. Outreach is not something the city does extremely well, but we will keep trying on it until we get it right. We'll work with the communities because again, there are no silver bullets. There are other things that we could and should be doing, and those will come into view as we continue to have this discussion. So with that, I will stop and allow for Ms. Rosen to make sure that she's curating all of our questions.
All right, take it away, Andrea.
Okay, for starters, Ms. Rosen dying here.
Dying.
So let me just say, as a threshold matter, I've tried to kind of group them into general topics, and unfortunately the sad part of me doing this job is I missed most of your presentation, so I'm so happy that we recorded it so I can go back and listen to everybody. I've tried to, well, first of all, let me say, as a threshold matter, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. Second of all, apologies for not maybe rewording in a manner that isn't quite as precise as you thought you were asking. I've kind of grouped them into some areas, and I want to say, you know, just as a general starting proposition as well, you know, there's always danger in going first, middle, and last in the order of a presentation. So the earlier speakers, who's Greg and Matt, for the later speakers who offered criticisms or questions about your presentations, you should always feel free to respond to the down the panel speakers' criticisms or comments, okay? So just say that as a threshold matter. I know our audience is interested in that. And that kind of goes without saying, but it's one of those things I'm gonna say anyway. Okay, so I have some groups of questions. I'm going to start with those, and then I have what I'm going to call cats and dogs, which are basically one-offs. So let's start with, there's several questions that basically question SACOG and the city and the state's projection for the unmet housing need. And I'm going to couple those questions with the general lack of data, questioning the general, I'm not asserting this, I'm just saying questioning the general lack of data support the goals set by the city in terms of how many housing units are needed. Considering the recent, so for example, I'm just going to read them all and then, you know, many of these are for Greg and Matt, but others can certainly pipe in. Okay, so this is about the projection for unmet housing need, which you emphasized in your presentations. Considering the recent US dense census data that shows California population growth has slowed, though the absolute number is still quite large, could you comment on whether there's a mismatch between the projection of housing units against the recent US census data that shows that California's population growth rate has slowed, although the absolute number, my understanding, is still quite large. So, you know, who is saying that we are millions of units behind? In some areas are short. One questioner says California is typically 15% of the national population and economy. How is it that the state estimate of 2.5 million is 55% of the national housing shortage of 4 million? Can the need be overestimated, as it has been called out by the Embarcadero Institute? Coupled with this is the notion of what defines need. Is there an assumption that everyone gets to say they want a 1,500 square foot home regardless of income anywhere in the state, or is need limited to the city boundaries or even neighborhood? Another question, let's see, another question about census data. Okay, let's talk about, let's get some reaction from Matt. And before I go to the next grouping, let's get the question from Matt and Greg. And if there are any other presenters who would like to speak to the issue. Several participants are questioning the projections of unmet housing need.
Okay, well, I'll take the first cut at housing need and how the state does it. SACOG does it a little bit differently. So the state looks at it from growth rates based on births and deaths and migration and jobs and kind of demographic factors that come into play. At SACOG, we talk to the planners in each of our jurisdictions on what growth rates are happening, how fast things are moving in terms of housing products, what plans are for growth projections within their own jurisdictions and what they're planning for based on what developers are planning for and what they're seeing as far as housing prices, rents, etc. So we kind of merged them together. The state does its own analysis. They come up with a number. We do ours based on, again, what I just said, jobs, job growth, and so forth. We compare the numbers. The state number always supersedes, but our numbers came consistent. And then from there, we do a mathematical model within the jurisdictions for the 22 cities and the 6 counties. That's all. For those that are really interested in the science of this, that can be found on the SACOG website for the regional housing needs allocation. There's a page, there's a web page on there, plus all the supporting data that goes on. So that took place between a year and a half ago and 3 years ago. That was a whole process for that. There's a state requirement on that.
I think that the key question here is, given that that there's a mismatch in timing, obviously there has to be, right? Because it's a very huge undertaking to project regional housing needs. Do you have an observation in light of the most recently revealed US Census data showing that California's population growth rate has slowed?
Well, it hasn't slowed in this region, and you can just see it anecdotally. I mean, go to any open house. There's a lot of people there. Rents are going up. There's demand for housing. So overall, statewide, that's probably true. What's going on with the pandemic? Pandemic's kind of thrown a wrench in kind of whatever was going on pre-pandemic. But people are moving out of some urban areas. They're moving out of San Francisco, but they're moving to the outer areas of the Bay Area, and some are moving here to Sacramento. So there's a lot going on, but the Sacramento region remains strong as far as growth.
Okay, we had several questions that basically challenged the city's lack of data for supporting its assertion that upzoning alone will result kind of ipso facto in an increase in the number of units and the types of units, the so-called missing middle types of units that the city desires. Could you talk about what data you're relying on for this policy proposal?
Suppose that question's directed at the city here.
Yes.
Go for it, Matt.
So, yeah, I think there's a little bit of mischaracterization in the question because, I went through, the 50 programs, not including everything we're doing in the policies. We understand that this is one piece of the pie, and I made that very clear in my presentation, right? But I think the evidence is very clear. When you only have, when 70% of your housing, 50% of your land mass is the most expensive housing type, and you have very limited choices. Other than that, housing costs are going to go up, right? There's multiple studies, and multiple studies that show lower, smaller units, especially those, as Bill Berg talked about, in our older neighborhoods, are cheaper. There's no. This is not a question. Multi-unit duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, ADUs are cheaper than single-family homes, rental and home ownership. And this strategy would allow a missing middle, both as home ownership and rental. And I think that's pretty clear. There's plenty of evidence and studies to show that.
If I could add something, Andrea, actually two things. We know when redevelopment funds went away that affordable housing construction slowed down remarkably and almost stopped in some places. So that certainly contributed, if you look back to 2008 to now, at the huge drop in what we had. The other thing that nobody has brought up that I think is important just to note here is the homeless situation and the lack of affordable housing and the contribution to the homeless issues that we have here in Sacramento and every municipality around the state. Those are things that come into play that we can't ignore as we look at this.
Okay, thanks. We have one neighbor in Curtis Park that says, my wife and I are in the process of buying our first home in Curtis Park. We're very excited, but we wish there were more housing options. If the proposed general plan land use changes were implemented, what would be the primary barrier to these kinds of missing middle housing? Financing, labor shortage, etc.
Yeah,
want to take that, Matt?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are barriers, right? And part of this is going to be part of our work over the next year and a half is how do we bring down some of those barriers. The reality is we don't have a development community or anybody that's been building these in 60 years because they've been illegal, right? So there isn't. I've talked to the development community. They haven't been doing these housing types, right? So it's kind of going to be a new thing for us. In addition, there's economy of scale challenges, right? So you go through a lot of the same hoops that you do for a larger development, mid-rise and high-rise, than you would for a triplex or fourplex. So I think there's a lot of challenges there. We have plenty of vacant lots throughout our city, thousands of vacant lots throughout our city that have high density, that have allowable zoning all through the city, and development's not occurring there. It's because the market's not there. So there are challenges there. The lowest hanging fruit here, as I talked about a little bit in my presentation, what we're seeing in other places, is really going to be when folks have a home that they're ready to remodel. It's a larger home, and they want a little more privacy in the home. Maybe they have someone who's aging. Maybe they have someone, a student who's wants their own privacy, etc. you can divide that existing home into 2 units, put an extra door on it, 3 units or 4 units. You see that all over the place in our city. That happened in the past, that continues to happen. That's really going to be where most folks take advantage of this opportunity to begin with. You know, for example, in Minneapolis, so there was a study quote in Minneapolis, which is not the study linked to this strategy, because Minneapolis, it only went into effect at the beginning of 2020. They have 1 year of data. So, and they allowed duplexes and triplexes throughout the city. So they were one of the first cities, right behind Grand Rapids, Michigan, to do this in the country, to bring this back. And what they have found in their first year of implementation, city of Minneapolis is 435,000 people. So it's a little bit smaller than our city, but about the same size. In the first year of implementation, 34 duplexes, 8 triplexes citywide. That's the scale that we're talking about. So there is challenges to implement that. So it's going to be a slow ramp up, just like Vice Mayor Chenier talked about with ADUs. Slow ramp up in the city of Sacramento in the last decade, where last year we had 76 ADUs, so you're very close, 76 ADUs that got building permits in the city. That's in 101 square miles, right? So we know that this isn't going to solve our housing crisis, but we need more housing choice and more lower cost housing options throughout the city.
So we do have a couple of questions related to that. We've had several questions about the ADUs, and kind of like basically following up on that, Matt, given the ADU mandate and a series of state housing bills going through the legislature, will the city be able to maintain control of its land use and zoning decisions? Coupled with that, a question about what evidence supports the city's proposition that increases in density yields increases in racial and economic diversity. Now, I know that those aren't directly related, but given that we do want to increase racial and economic diversity in not less diverse neighborhoods, and we do have the ADU mandate, which is designed to produce the smaller, cheaper units that the missing middle proposal is intended to target. Could you comment on, there's a question about the linkage between having more of these units and how is it going to increase racial and economic diversity?
Yeah, I'll start with your first question about the state moving forward with kind of superseding some of the local land use control. Well, I think that you'll see that at a state level because jurisdictions, not the city of Sacramento, but jurisdictions historically in California, many have block housing, all housing. And that's one of the reasons we're in this crisis in the first place, because folks didn't want housing of any type in their community. You see that all over. People are not, jurisdictions refusing to zone so that you could bring housing in at all. And so we got ourselves into this bind because jurisdictions refuse to take any action to do anything about it. And that's why, as Greg talked about, the state asserting itself with the RENA requirement and housing element, and you're going to get more and more of this because jurisdictions don't build housing. And now we know we don't build housing, but they put up barriers intentionally to keep folks from building housing. So what we need to do, one of the key things we can do is to remove those barriers, right? To remove those traditional barriers from building housing. We know, it's pretty obvious what those are. And we have done a lot in the city to do that. We're going to continue to look at that to make sure that we can continue to build the housing that we need. In terms of, ensuring diversity, well, I guess, I think using a case example in Curtis Park, anybody know what the median house sale price in Curtis Park is right now?
It's about $550 to $575.
I think that's low, but let's say it is. Let's say it's.
Well, I was excluding Park Village.
Okay, yeah. Well, okay. So let's say it's 750,000 because that's probably what it is in Curtis Park. 2 ones are going for sale for 750, close to it in Curtis Park. So let's say it's 750. What is it? 700,000 plus. There you go. Thank you. 700,000 plus. What's 20% of 700,000? Right? And so that's, you start doing the math. That's the buy-in to even get into your community. That's what you need. $140,000 to even start to play. Then you have to have a perfect record, you have the perfect credit score, and then you've got to line up against the 40 other people that have cash offers from the Bay Area to get in. That's what's happening in Curtis Park and throughout our neighborhoods in Sacramento, is that if we want true diversity, if we want socioeconomic diversity, as Vice Mayor Chenier is saying, we have to have other options beyond $750,000 median price for a home. We have to have rental and home ownership rate options throughout. So we need ADUs, we need manufactured housing, we need duplexes, we need triplexes, we need mid-rises, and we need high rises in our downtown. Our downtown's slated for high rises. Kirk showed that map of the colors. You'll notice that all the red is downtown. It's on the commercial corridors. You start going up a little bit. Our residential neighborhoods are the lowest floor area ratio or lowest density that we have in our city. It's going to be 1, as Bill Berg mentioned, right? But we have to have different choices, other options. I want diverse neighbors, and they're not going to be able to, they're not showing up when they have to have $140,000 cash to play.
Okay, let's do a quick segue. We had several questions about tax consequences. So given that Prop 13 is partly based on the zoning of the land for tax assessment purposes, has the city considered the tax consequences of the proposed zoning change in terms of both Prop 13 implication as well as county assessor's obligation to reassess any increases or decreases in land valuation for property tax purposes?
I've been talking a lot.
So
yes.
It's a twofold.
I'll let someone else take this one. Yeah.
Okay, so twofold tax question. One's on Prop 13, and I'm not that well versed in Prop 13, but I know that the dividing line is commercial versus residential. And then the other is there anything about this upzoning proposal that you believe might trigger reassessments of parcels? And I guess let's bifurcate that question into before or after construction, because I think the example that you gave, Matt, when you said somebody has a large home, they're ready to move, they're ready to downsize, they take their 4-bedroom, 2-bath old Curtis Park home and divide it into 3 units. I think it's a foregone conclusion that after they receive approval for those 3 units and the new addresses and all that, they're going to be reassessed. So let's just, I mean, do you agree with that? Yeah.
Sure, if you do, yeah. If you
okay, so let's just focus on, let's get to the bottom of this question because it's come up many times, sure, whether parcels would be reassessed once they were eligible to have multi-units on them.
Yeah, I mean, when you're pulling building permits, there's certain linkages to, having reassessed. If you sell your property, you're going to do a complete renovation. There are certain things that trigger that. But if what I will say is, when we just talked about the median price being $700,000, and say someone bought that house 40 years ago, you've got $600,000, $700,000 worth of equity there as well. So I mean, I think that there's an offset, and the reason your equity is so high is because we have a housing crisis. We're not building housing, so your equity continues to inflate, which is great for those who already have homes. That's wonderful, but it's not great for our future.
So I didn't get an answer to the question of whether there would be a property tax assessment or a Proposition 13 implication from, let's say I'm on R1 right now, and I have an ADU. I did get reassessed when I built my ADU, but let's say I take my single family home and split it into a duplex. If before I do that, will there be a property tax implication?
So I can follow up with you. We're going to be doing a frequently asked questions revision. There's lots of questions, and that's actually a Sacramento County question. They do the assessment. So that's not my purview nor my division.
All right, we'll punt on that. Next, we've got a lot of questions related to what I would broadly call the question of fit. One participant says, our home is on a large plot in Curtis Park. I'd like to know what incentives exist for adding units while keeping our primary residence on the plot as well. Another fit question, how much danger is there that the zoning code update following the general plan update could result in zones that technically could allow multiple homes on a lot, but with standards that make them impossible to build? And I'm inferring here that what the questioner says when she says standards, she means setbacks and height limits. Let me throw in one other question to fit, a really good one. The homes on 24th Street, Matt, now the old homes are mostly single story, a couple of 2 stories are now backing onto 3-story townhomes behind them. Why would we have allowed 3-story on Crocker Drive and not in other places in the neighborhood?
Okay, so there's 3 questions, and there are actually 3 different questions. So I think I wrote them down here, so I can take them.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll try to take them one by one. So the first question was, want to do additional housing units or ADUs, my lot, what are incentives there? So yeah, I mean, as we talked about this evening, you know, accessory dwelling units are certainly part of the overarching strategy. There's a lot of traction both in the state and in the city. And in fact, we're bringing forward an ADU ordinance here, revisions, a permanent ordinance at the city council here soon. So if you're a fan of ADUs, come out and support it. But essentially, yeah, there's a lot of incentives in the ADUs. There's no impact fees if you build an ADU less than 750 square feet. We're going to have off the shelf ADU permit ready plans for folks to use. We're going to have a step-by-step toolkit for folks to get in there and learn how to do it. So yeah, there's certainly, you're seeing a lot of folks really move forward. And in fact, Councilmember Harris is building an ADU right now. So he's got a lot of lessons to learn there, which is really exciting. In terms of-
And he's happy to come to your home and give you a lesson on it as well.
Yes, yes. Yeah, he's building it, I think himself, which is really impressive.
With his daughter.
Yeah, it's really great. In terms of development standards, yeah, absolutely. So the first step, as I talked about, my presentation, is the adoption of the general plan, which includes this land use map that Kirk showed in his presentation, that assigns, and I'm not going to get into the weeds, but assigns a floor area ratio, which is basically, you know, how many units you can have in this little cube. And then we absolutely need to, before this becomes effective, update our planning and development code. One, we need to change the definitions of what's allowed in our R1 and R2 zones, or single family or duplex dwelling zones. And two, we are absolutely committed to making sure that development standards work. As I talked about in my presentation, it's going to be twofold. One, it's going to move forward the policy direction that unanimously was moved forward by council to allow these types of missing middle housing types, but also respect that neighborhood scale. And so things like we're talking about now, height, the allowable height in all single family zones right now is 35 feet. We don't anticipate that changing. That's a good neighborhood scale height. So we'll be looking at things like the open space that we talked about in setbacks. So yeah, absolutely, that's going to be updated after the adoption of the general plan. And lastly, on the 24th Street example, I haven't looked at that. You know, it's hard to answer questions about specific properties because one, I don't know what the zoning is. So I'd want to look at that and see what the development standards are for that particular lot. It's very possible that you're talking about an R3 zone or an R2 zone. I'm not sure. So we can take a look at that. But there certainly is going to be, and has been, a lot of emphasis on neighborhood scale and transition, and you know where those varying housing types and heights are appropriate.
Matt, I'll take a walk down Crocker Drive and 24th Street with you anytime. There was
perfect.
No attention paid to scale and height and all that good stuff on Crocker Drive. They're almost all three-story houses, and what's behind them are single-story houses. So, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Let's go to a question of the alternatives that have been proposed and the impact of upzoning on current low-income neighborhoods. How do you keep investors from buying up low-income housing when it becomes available, and controlling escalating rents? There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of assertion about affordability, and I think everybody understands that you're not talking about regulation affordable housing, you're talking about market affordable housing. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's been very confusing for many of us to have the city talk about getting affordable housing, having private developers go into upzoned lots and build smaller units, when the term affordable housing historically has been used to refer to what I would call regulated affordable housing for extremely low income and low income families where the rents are highly regulated. So in terms of the issue of affordability here, what is your crystal ball on how are you going to keep investors from buying up low income housing when it becomes available, and developing multiple units and increasing rents?
Yeah, I think that's another one for me. I'm going to pitch one of these to another panelist.
Else. I hope you guys, I'm going to try and find some.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I'm happy to answer that. So look, and I appreciate the question. Protecting residents from displacement is an absolute priority for the housing element. We have a whole neighborhood development action team that is focused on that. We encourage folks to review the draft policies and programs related to this in our housing element. We have a complete chapter. We have a goal with all kinds of policies and programs. We have a lot of existing things in place to really work on making sure folks can stay in their home and in their communities and their businesses. Absolutely important. It's also important to know, as I mentioned earlier, there are vacant lots all over the city with zoning that allows higher densities like R3, R4, C2. You can do virtually anything that have remained vacant for years, 2 housing element cycles, 16 years. More flexible zoning on its own doesn't mean investment will occur. The market forces aren't there. But what I will say, and as Vice Mayor Chenier said, look, we're going to evaluate this. We're going to follow this very closely like we do with all other housing, just like we do with ADUs. We're going to be reporting and coming back to City Council every year. And if we're seeing negative trends or unintended consequences, we'll make refinements. This is, we make changes and refinements to our planning and development code every year. And so we're going to continue to look at that. We're also tracking all the best practices and what's happening in Portland and Minneapolis, looking at apples for apples. And, I do caution, you said I could do some rebuttals. I do caution using data and statistics that is not verified, also using studies that are not comparable to what we're doing. We're talking about, 2 duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. The studies that were referenced are talking about high density, high rise and mid-rise around transit stations in New York City and Chicago. It is not a comparative study. So if you have any studies related to duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes and how that's causing displacement, please do send it. I mean that sincerely. Send it my way. We are going to study that. This is a very serious issue for us as a city.
Okay, Mr. Berg.
Yes. Can
I ask you? Yes. Here's the question. Do you believe that the goal of the city's policy is to transform all of the city to resemble the historic districts as you described?
No, I'm not sure where that idea would come from. I'm sorry. But speaking of, if it's okay, I'd like to provide some response to the previous question about demolishing naturally affordable housing. As I mentioned, a lot of naturally affordable housing is naturally affordable just because it's old, and preservation incentives
Can you define your term of naturally affordable, since we now have 3 different types of affordability here?
It's affordable because it's old, because it's no longer new and fashionable. Maybe it's not necessarily old enough where it's going to be necessarily recognizable as, where someone's going to look, oh, it's a historic house. And we're not talking about new buildings designed to look like historic homes. We're talking about actually old buildings. There are actually a set of incentives that the city has. There's the Mills Act, which allows the owners of historic properties to pay lower property taxes. There's the Historic Places Grant Program, which is a matching grant, except for people with low income.
The city says it's intended to accomplish.
Sorry. Okay, we've got other comments, and then actually one thing that's happening statewide is there was a state historic rehab tax credit passed a couple of years ago. It's currently in the process of hopefully being funded, and that one, unlike the federal tax credit, will let individual property owners get rehab funds for their own homes. And all of these programs include extra bumps, either higher point value for getting into the Mills Act program or additional percentages for restricted income affordable housing. So the idea is, in some cases, it can be a really good idea to tie things like historic rehab tax credits with affordable housing tax credits, like we saw with Wall or the Bellevue. And single family homes are a different equation, but part of keeping neighborhoods affordable is not losing the housing in the first place. And a preservation ordinance and things like our current ordinance, where buildings over 50 years old have to be reviewed for eligibility for the Sacramento Register, are tools from that. But it's easiest of all if we've already surveyed the entire city. City of LA, city of Denver, a lot of cities surveyed every building over 30 years old. So they know where the historic buildings are. And more importantly, they know where the non-historic buildings are. And they have a citywide view of where they can immediately put infill and where preservation incentives might be applied one place and then new construction in another place.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the impact of densification on the city's aging water and sewer infrastructure. Given that increasing population density is inevitable, aging sewer and water systems are going to have increasing loads placed upon them with greater density. Do you support or oppose increasing city taxes to build new water and sewer systems that can handle the increased load and avoid the low flow, lack of water in the lines, as well as backflow sewer problems? Who wants that?
I'm happy to take the question about infrastructure.
Yeah, and I can do that.
Please go ahead.
Well. No, what I was going to say is this is something that we started pretty soon after I got elected, we hadn't done anything about our water and sewer systems really, other than catastrophic failures in many, many years. And we passed, I believe it was a $135 million bond issue. It's been a while, so I may be slightly wrong on the amount, but to start replacing pipes. Our pipes were averaging 100 years and older. So that's something that we're gonna have to do regardless of what happens. And something that we have to continue to do regardless of what we do on the densification issue. I do think that this is a small enough percentage that as long as we can keep doing the regular maintenance and do that well, we shouldn't have a problem. And Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, that's correct. Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. One, as I talked about in my presentation, we're conducting a master environmental impact report, which is going to evaluate the impact of the 2040 general plan policies and programs, including this strategy. And it's going to include analysis of impacts on utilities and service systems, hydrology and water quality. Also, we have a sewer impact for our separated system, sewer impact fee for our separated system, and a combined sewer impact fee in combined systems that were created to mitigate for incremental sewer impacts, such as this one we're talking about. Larger projects, which is not this strategy, but larger projects of 25 units or more, need to demonstrate utility system capacity. If they don't have it, they have to pay for it, mitigate it for it. And that's why, for example, we have in the Central City, when we did the Central City specific plan, we have the Central City impact fee that works on that very thing. So when folks building in Central City need to do upgrades, they have a fund to do that. They're all paying in to help out to make sure that that's a reality.
Is that fee actually being charged? I thought it was waived for years.
It is being charged, yeah. So City Council decided to do it in 4 parts. So it started out with 25%. It's at 50% now. And we're going to be having that discussion with City Council on the next several months about taking it to the third step, or 75%.
So we have a question for Chris Jones. Is the widening effect of density an artifact of the fact that a Black family in a detached house being replaced by a single white family has 1/4 the effect on demography that a single Black family being replaced by 4 white families? And did Minneapolis home price increase data compare the rent charged for a single family dwelling against a newly legalized 2-family dwelling in the same neighborhood?
Okay, so those are really good questions. So, okay, so yeah, I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the chat here. So to answer your question about the New York study, they did raw analysis of the numbers of various ethnicities and races who lived in the area prior to the changes versus after the changes. And there was a 5 to 9% decrease in the share of minority residents. So that answers that question. As far as the Minneapolis study, as Matt mentioned, it is very early. That just goes to speak to the experimentalness of this program. We're focused on being first and being bold and being out there rather than doing things that are known to produce the effects that we're looking for. But to answer your question, they did find, compared to similar properties, there was a 3 to 5% increase. That's specifically in the housing prices to purchase the property, not necessarily to rent it. But we can anticipate a similar increase in rents as well.
Okay, questions. We're going to take a couple more. One for Kirk. Regarding the bottom-up and neighborhood level decision-making, don't you think homeowners will vote to keep the housing shortage in effect so that their properties will continue the dizzying increase in value they've seen since the started the housing crisis in the 70s and 80s? What about livability for people who didn't get in on that and have to pay the prices your cohort is selling houses for?
Yeah, good question. The answer is no. And I can say that emphatically because about 14 months ago, I called for a community to come together to develop its vision and issues statement for the 2040 general plan. We produced an 8-page document that we sent to Matt and the city in general. We got a lot of good comments back from it, acknowledging the work. It was a 50-person group that authored that paper. There was the principals from City College, the park manager from Land Park, as well as members from the executive teams of all the neighborhood associations, and all 50 people signed the document. In the housing element, there was a request for missing middle housing, for additional housing. And we identified that need because our children were not able to stay in our communities. They were having to move out of Sacramento because we, as we aged, didn't want to stay in our houses. We would like to be able to move out, give them to a next generation or sell them and have a smaller place to live. So we asked for missing middle housing. We asked for cluster homes. We asked for townhomes. Now the key is there. We did ask for units also to buy. It was not an emphasis on rental. It was wanting to be able to buy housing. But so we asked that, and we thoroughly expected in the response and in the early response of Matt's questions to us that says, do you still want this? And we said, yes, we do. We thoroughly expected we were going to be able to suggest where that would go. And that was in order to go ahead and rejuvenate our Broadway corridor, which was dying, to go ahead and make our communities more walkable around Taylor's Market and around Gunther's and around Vic's ice cream store, these small neighborhood centers. They were slowly sort of dying on the vine, and we needed more density around them. That's where we wanted to add those missing middle housing. We had a vision for the Sprout Center down below Land Park as to way underutilized and could have possibly a 6-story affordable senior housing on top of the Sprouts Market, and then duplexes and garden apartments going all the way down Los Rios Boulevard. So we had a vision, and we want to implement that vision. And we've asked Matt, do you think that our vision will meet the goals that you have? And he indicated back to us, yes, they're good visions. They're good alternatives. They should be explored. However, as an alternative to blanket opening R1 zoning, it might not meet the equity needs and optics of the city of wanting just to open all residential areas to all people and all styles of construction. This is an abdication of zoning and all the possibilities of zoning and good urban design. So to answer that question, I forgot the question. I guess I ran on, but help me, Andrea.
On what the question was?
Yeah.
I think you did answer it, Kirk. So in the interest of time, we've got 3 minutes left. I want to I want to thank you, and I want to ask a final question. And before I do that, I want to apologize to the few individuals who were screaming in the chat about the questions not being asked exactly as they were worded. Those questions were 150-word questions, and that's simply not possible in this type of forum. So Rachel Iskow asks, she supports the effort to do away with single-family zoning as a tool to create more diverse housing opportunities to ensure some of the new supply will be occupied by lower-income households. Would the city consider providing incentives to owners who rent or sell the new units to lower-income households, perhaps low-cost construction loans and fee waivers, or even better would be forgivable loans? And Matt, I'm afraid that's actually it's probably for Jay too.
I'm happy to start.
It's a policy question. It's a policy question. So we had a lot of questions really questioning the affordability assertions. Yes. And I think that this is a good final question for, if push came to shove, would the city be able or willing to pursue actions or policies that would ensure, I'm going to call it market affordability since we're not talking about regulated affordable housing?
So I'll start very briefly. again, I said this before, everything should be on the table. We need a host of multiple solutions to this. There's no silver bullets on it. I think that there would be support for a lot of what you mentioned, Andrea. I think the question is one of resources. I mean, we put $31.5 million into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We have already spent 10 million of that on a Mercy housing project on Stockton Boulevard, which will be about 220 units, and then 4 million on a senior affordable housing project up in the rail yards. So that money will go very, very quickly. We will probably try to do more and refill it, but it's really one of resources. And as we look kind of across the spectrum of what we can do, whether we're buying and converting old motels, whether we're doing affordable housing, and I agree with Chris, it's very expensive, although those numbers generally include services. So we need to compare apples to apples on that. But I think all of that's up for discussion. It's just going to depend on resources and where we can get the biggest bang for limited bucks.
Okay, thank you, Jake. So that's going to close out the Q&A. I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, Kathy Less.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. You did a great job. I appreciate that. And thank you, everyone. Especially thank you to our speakers for taking your time. We probably should have billed this as a 2-hour evening. We tried to keep it a little shorter, but it didn't quite work out that way. So thanks for sticking with us. We had a great attendance, lots of chatting going on in the chat box, lots of questions, and clearly a lot of interest. So you can follow up at our website, sierra2.org, if you'd like to listen to a recording again of this program or later, or pass it on once it's up there. And any supplemental materials we'll probably create a little resource list or something like that. We're not really sure yet what we'll do to follow up. But thank you and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Good night.
Okay.